we're going to do with this one is first we're going to open up with just stating about my Patreon. I'm posting it right now in the chat, and just if you feel inclined, please donate. It goes from $1 all the way up to $100 for each of the levels. It really helps me out as I am on disability, and it really helps out the channel start to develop, because I'm below the level of getting ads. And now into this actual live stream itself. Basically, we're going to go over the Michael Cohen hearing, which is currently going on. What we're going to be going over is basically his representation first. He is being represented by Lanny Davis, former Clinton ally that was basically has worked on her campaigns, and he still supports her in elections and all of her ventures. So when it comes down to that, and his statement is that he is working there without pay now, or pro bono, as we would state. Now, this would seem as quite suspect, and we need to realize that this would be very, very suspect as is, and one would need to assume that this is probably not the truth. When we look at some of the realistic things, there's been noted points that it's probably Tom Steyer who's putting out the finances. This is actually what was suggested on the actual panel, that Tom Steyer is the one who is actually putting up the actual finances for Lanny Davis to represent him for the hearing. Because frankly, it doesn't matter for what reason with it. I doubt Lanny Davis is going to say, you know what, I just feel like for the day I'm just going to do this because I'm not doing anything at Fox News for the day, for Fox News or CNN or whatever news site I'm at representing for the day for whatever reason. I just don't feel like there's any need to go and I'm not being called over there for the day to give my political or legal opinion on anything. So I'm going to represent this. I'm going to represent Michael Cohen for free at this hearing in Washington, D.C. Now, frankly, anybody that has any sense in their head is going to say, hey, this does not make any sense whatsoever. This is basically looking like something's a little bit fishy here. And that's why we need to look from that aspect and say something's a little bit fishy at that point. And this is why we get to his reliability. Well, when we get to his reliability of Michael Cohen, we see that he's not exactly the most reliable witness. And when we're looking at what you want for an actual witness on any type of case, when we're talking about what they're talking about in this idea of the U.S.-Russian election interference, or whatever you want to call it, involving Trump, or whichever type of statement you want to call it, where basically you need to look at the reliability of the witness. And when we're talking about this, is you need to see about, well, number one is how much into the case is this person, and how reliable is the person. And when it looks like this person is not very reliable, he's known as the judge which states, the judge who sentenced him on basically lying about real estate, it basically treat him as a known liar without remorse. That's not exactly a good statement for his reliability. And when we're talking about someone who you want as reliability for a witness, that's not very good. Number two is we need to see how he actually got onto this, got to this committee, and he was only meeting with one side, and he was actually invited by the Democrats, and was essentially, that was his entourage to basically get into the committee itself. Now it seems like that they were almost trying to paint an actual picture. And we see this specifically because they're essentially limiting the scope of the questions. And this has been noted. Now, when we see that they're limiting the scope of the questions, they're trying to limit what's coming in on a lot of the stuff that's of what's being asked and what can actually come as evidence. This shows as being something very, very suspect as what's going on. And that's something that really, when it comes down to it, is not only are you impacting on the are you trying to boost this guy, are you trying to cover for this guy's reliability, you're covering up for actually the questionability of the hearing itself. Now we need to actually look at the conclusion of the U.S. hearing on what we had for the of the Trump-Russia collusion. Now, I think this is coming to a lot of what this why this hearing was made, is when they made their call stating that there was no collusion. I think that what we found is that Adam Schiff who is one of the people who was in this envoy for Cohen, coming in and talking with other people such as the chairman who is of this committee, Elijah Cummings. He was one of the people who actually was one of the people in this envoy for all these people. You see that it seems like it was that they were mad that the actual outcome of this hearing was, of the actual hearings on the Senate side, was that there was no actual collusion because they looked at the evidence. So they wanted to create essentially a counter narrative on the House side, since they actually controlled the House side. So they wanted, even if they can't get an actual report out, they would adopt that whole point. They wanted to actually get an actual narrative going out through the idea of hearings. And this is why we look at now we need to go at the idea of logic on this. Now we need to look at logic on the whole situation. Is beyond this, is when we look at the whole thing, is what is they start bringing up the idea of Roger Stone. Now when we look at this thing of Roger Stone, number one is Roger Stone, when it looks at the timeline, we see the timeline that Roger Stone did not release any information from WikiLeaks before WikiLeaks had it. He did not have any information of WikiLeaks before that released it early. He did not tell Trump of any early WikiLeaks. We don't have any information of this. This is an actual fact, which means the any release from WikiLeaks would have been on their own. It would have been completely independent of Roger Stone. So any statement from the Democrats of any of this point would have been comparing any relationships between Julian Assange and Roger Stone would have been erroneous, because Roger Stone and Julian Assange have never met. They've never had any correspondence beyond basically just general statements like anybody else can have on Twitter. And there have been plenty of other people who've had statements, and with that basis, you can pretty much, if you're going to do that, you might as well start arresting nearly half the people in the country. If we're going to do that point, and that was the only type of correspondence he was able to have, and it had nothing to do with those with any document drop. It was just general correspondences on after these documents were dropped. It was post document drop, not pre. So, and he was not requesting, he has never requested early access to documents anyway. If you look at his feed before he had his account taken out by Twitter. Now, if we look at the fact of what they went after for him, essentially was a misstatement with the FBI and basically essentially not fitting profile that they had of him. That's purely what the issue the and that's what needs to be understood, is that he didn't fit this profile that the FBI had of him, and the FBI got mad because the FBI did very, very poor work, and they kind of typecasted everything in, and they weren't exactly doing their work instead of looking at all areas and realizing that they're kind of going down the wrong area, I should say, for the source, and realizing that if you don't investigate and independently look at the actual server itself that the so-called emails were taken from, and if you don't investigate that yourself, which means both the Clinton server and the actual DNC server, if you don't take those and actually do forensic investigations yourself and say they're allowed to use their own people to actually do forensic investigations on, well, you're not going to get anything accurate, and the actual investigation is going to be tainted from the start. And if they refuse to hand those over, that means you essentially should not be even filing any charges to begin with, and the case should be dropped, because that means they're trying to hide something, and that means they're essentially, it's nothing more than trying to pin something on those people, and they were doing something illegal. And that this is where logic should be leading us to. And that it's that they're actually potentially gathering money from other sources, and that's where all these things should be leading you to when you start looking at all of them. And it's basically is that it would lead you to the next thing, which is how fast were the documents transferred. Well, we know that the documents were transferred at such a rate that it could not have come from overseas, which eliminates the culpability of any foreign agent. Unless you had someone directly from Russia that actually worked within the DNC itself, it could not have done so, because it was shown that the actual download rate was actually that of a pen drive. And that's the whole point, and that's what needs to be understood. And that's when we're talking about these download rates with it, and what actually comes with it, we know that it wasn't downloaded overseas, because when you start going overseas, you start having to download other packages. So it was likely downloaded from a pen drive, because you don't have to get those packages because you're downloading remotely, and that makes it a lot faster because you're not doing it over the web. And that's what the time signatures of the of how the document was downloaded would have shown. and that's something that's very, very important that no one in this whole investigation has looked at, because it doesn't fit the tiny little amounts that they want to look at. Now, when it comes to Cohen, this Cohen investigation, they're looking at totally illegitimate points. They're looking at the idea of if Trump paid off somebody who accused him of sexual assault, who basically accused him of not sexual assault but sleeping with them, and that's basically, many people have basically paid off people who've basically done these accusations, and they do it because they want to keep it out of the news. That's solely a factor, and they do this basically even if the claims are erroneous, and this is a major factor. You do this when you want to keep erroneous claims out of the news because of this, of the way it would impact any type of thing of your public appearance. And you figured that there's a certain value of your public image if this were to basically come out in the open during a certain period or at all. And this is why you say, this is the amount I'll pay with it, and you put a certain value on it, and this is why, and you make a certain negotiation on it, and this is where this came from. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the accusation has to be true. In most of the cases, these accusations are completely false, and that's what needs to be understood. And most of the time, these people are making false accusations and are doing it basically because they're looking for fame, or their time of fame actually completely faded, and they're looking to basically get back in the limelight. And it's basically, which is why if they're getting payments, they don't like those payments because it's not what they're looking for. They'd rather have the limelight than the actually payment, because the payments is kind of like that silver medal. They'd rather have the fame because the fame can generate a lot more money. But the people know that the payment's going to be far short of what the actual outcome would be. Now, when we look at, go back to the idea of Cohen himself, is when we start looking at him actually as a witness, is he reliable? And what type of witnesses, if they're actually looking for a witness out there, is on this stand, if they're trying to make their own conclusion from the House of Representatives, what type of conclusion should they be making? And this is the fact is they shouldn't be meeting with a guy like Cohen, because number one, he's going to jail for essentially lying and not being remorseful about it. This is from the judge's words, as stated before. Number two is the fact is when you want a hearing, you want someone who's actually close to the situation. You don't want a guy who's actually pretty far away from the actual election team. If you're trying to come up with some type of conclusion, he's pretty irrelevant when it comes down to that. If you're going to say this is an FEC violation, then you're really stretching for things. I mean, that's as weak of an FEC violation as you can get. When we look at real FEC violations, you can point to the Clinton team taking money that's actually been caught on video of taking money from people that are overseas. From people, we've seen people from Canada that wanted to donate money to Clinton, and we've seen this on video. And we've also seen the actual FEC violations for the Bernie Sanders campaign in 2016. He actually had to pay fines for this. So if we're going to actually look at true FEC violations, we need to see things that have actually impacted the campaign, of legitimate campaign donations, things that actually go into the campaign, actually go directly where it actually directly finances, not something to basically hold back news. That's not campaign donations. That's not what we can be considered really an FEC violation. in its actual truest sense. So when we're looking at the this is we also need to start looking at what is actually Cohen's electoral support in the past and his current electoral support, and what does this mean? Well, when we start to look at who he has voted for, you're going to see it's always been Democrats. Now, this is a major problem because, okay, yes, Trump used to be a Democrat, which would have been his time when Cohen was initially hired, which would have been fine. But as Trump became a Republican, this would have been an issue. And this would have been a certain time of a conflict of interest between the two. Some type of conflict, or I shouldn't say conflict, but a conflict between the two, which would have caused a certain breaking apart of the two when it came down to what each of the two had for their political interests in the region. Whereas Trump would have been looking as being a Republican and more Republican needs, Cohen's going to go in the complete opposite direction. So there's going to be essentially a complete and utter political split. And when it comes to lawyers, they're going to be essentially political animals. We saw put up forth of the in the committee brought forth by Mark Meadows that yes Cohen was acting as essentially a lobbyist, which shows that he's essentially acting as a lobbyist on behalf of Democratic needs, or Democratic wants, I should say. So if we're talking about this, is that he's acting on a political nature, that this should be a big issue. There's going to be a definite split between the two when it comes to what you're doing. And even if you might be just doing this one last thing with it, with basically just trying to pay off one or two people from basically bringing a major thing to the limelight and trying to destroy an image, it's basically comes down to what he's supporting politically, and this will basically call into question the reliability of the actual witness. And that's something needs to be brought forth, is if he's basically someone that's politically on one side, and even that's basic, and then the Democrats are actually looking toward him as bringing him forward, that's something that makes it very, very light, lower in liability. Then you have him being disbarred. You have his record of obtaining loans with basically lying about his debt to asset ratio, which basically would have gotten him a loan with a lower rate, which essentially is fraudulent, which is why he's going to prison. And the lawyer said he was a liar without remorse. Well, this makes for a very, very bad witness, and it makes it for a witness which is essentially going to be hostile toward Republicans and going to be friendly toward the Democrats. He didn't meet with Republicans. He only met with Democrats. He basically was showing support for the only Republicans, he didn't even mention any by name, but the only Republicans he was stating support for in his opening statement were ones that he was basically stating as never Trumpers. Basically people who are completely against Trump regardless of the reason. And he was stating these Democrats he was supporting. He supported Democrats who are basically dealing with this Trump derangement syndrome of basically the usual impeach 45 garbage. and it just basically shows that he's completely political when it comes down to what his opening statements were. And it shows that he was completely political in his opening statements. And when we're talking about a witness, that's not what you want. You don't want a witness who is essentially political in his opening statements and then going into some type of statements trying to say that, yeah, I lied before, but I'm not a liar. Well, that's not very, very convincing, because the fact is if you're lied before, you are a liar. If you've obtained loans on false pretenses, then you're not reliable of a person. If you've been disbarred, you have to go pretty far to be disbarred. When we look at Michael Avenatti, I mean, this person is as unreliable as can be, and really is not a lawyer who anybody should be hiring. He's basically considered to be the bottom of the barrel when it comes to lawyers. And if Michael Avenatti still has his is still barred by these standards, that should give you a little bit of a clue of how bad Michael Cohen is to be disbarred, and what it actually takes to be disbarred. You actually have to go pretty far to be disbarred, and Michael Cohen is disbarred. That should give you a little bit of a clue how bad of a witness this is. It shows that you have no actual reliability. There is no reliability of a witness. And then when you come to these events, when you come to these actual sessions, you need to actually have a witness that's actually reliable. I mean, if you're going to actually try to prove any type of case, either way, I mean, it just makes complete sense to have a reliable witness. Don't be bringing in witnesses that are actually completely flawed. I mean, you don't want to be bringing in a witness of that level. I don't care what their job is, but make sure they're not completely flawed, because it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Because if you're doing that, you're basically going to create a situation because of what you're dealing with here. You're dealing with a person who's basically completely and utterly flawed, and they're not going to be believable. And when we're talking, the Democratic side has to basically say, we're going to limit the scope of what questions can be asked. Well, if you have to go that far just to basically limit the truth that comes out, that's a little bit extreme. And we even had a witness say, basically question the idea of facts. Well, the fact is there is only one form of facts, and that's the facts. And when you have a witness questioning facts, that's not a reliable witness. And that's what we had. That's what we're having today, is a witness questioning facts. And that's quite insane. What we're seeing out there is we're seeing a witness who's questioning facts, and they're saying that, oh, these facts are unreliable, and, well, no, they're the facts. Either you have facts or you have lies. Pretty explicit when it comes to either side. And it's really kind of obvious which side you should be on. Either A, you're telling facts, or B, you're not telling facts. And when it comes to these hearings, you should not be, if you're going to be bringing on a person who's lying, you should be basically, the only purpose for that should be basically to disprove their story. It should not be to basically have them out there to prove that they're a reliable witness. And if you're on the Democrat side, that's not exactly something that you should have been bringing out there as a reliable witness. Just talking from their aspect, this is not a reliable witness. That is a completely horrible witness. And when we're looking at this, this is about the bottom of the barrel. He's not reliable whatsoever. He's considered to be a liar without remorse, from what the judge was saying, and that's not what you want. You want an actual guy or girl out there who's going to be basically saying the truth. And to see that they don't have that, that shows you should be going in a completely different. That means the story's actually a completely different direction. We see that basically it's showing that there is no link. We've gone 2 years on this whole collusion thing and haven't found anything. This means that you're going in the wrong direction. If we wanted to actually find out what actually happened with this, we need to and what actually happened with why these leaks happen with these emails, you need to start looking elsewhere. I would say that if they wanted actually truth on this, try bringing in interviews with Kim.com and William Binney. Kim.com is an actual positive hacker that actually looks for negative, that actually looks for security deficiencies and tries to fix them. And you have people like William Binney, who is a former high-end person of the NSA that was an actual whistleblower. And he can actually explain they could both explain that the download rates at the time would have actually shown that it had to have come within the actual building, or within the actual realm of that building. It could not have come anywhere else because of the way that downloads actually happen. And that the further you are away, the slower the speed gets. And that's an actual fact, and you can't deny that. Which means that basically for the actual speed for this to have happened, it would have had to have happened at that time. And though this doesn't fit the actual narrative, it would have to go with that, and then they'd have to start going with that and start prosecuting some of these people that actually started to divvy out these plans for essentially overthrowing the election, and they'd have to start prosecuting those people, which that's the way they should have handled it. And that's something that it might not be popular, but that's the way it should be handled. And they're just going to have to face facts that basically, that when it comes down to it, is Russia really didn't have an actual favorite in the election. When it came down to it, is for positive on energy development, is they preferred Hillary Clinton because she had Tom Steyer on her side, who is basically who has energy investments in China, and she was going to essentially advocate for foreign oil production, which is going to benefit foreign oil and foreign natural gas production, which is going and tended to more shut down the U.S. from exporting any type of these ideas of fossil fuels, which would have benefited Russia. Now, that's where Clinton was supported on that end. But on foreign policy, because Clinton was spouting these insane ideas of going to war and saying that she wanted to blow up Russia over something that was completely unproven, that's where they wanted to support Trump, because Trump was not irrational on that point of view. He was saying, hold on a minute, we don't want to go to war over something not proven. And that's where you found that they essentially, on certain aspects, were putting certain ads on for Hillary, certain ads for Bernie, certain ads for Trump near the end. And it was split. And it wasn't necessarily sowing discourse in the elections, it was just a matter of they had certain areas that they were basically supporting in certain realms, and that was it. And the amount of ads actually launched when it comes down to what we know on just Facebook alone were so few and far between. It was insignificant. I mean, money wise, it was so small. It was basically, you're talking the amount that Hillary Clinton launched just within that the out in Ohio in the last in just like the last week was basically, we're talking well over like 30 times that amount of what Russia actually used during the whole time of the during the whole election period of the whole election period itself. And that's what we're talking about, the whole election cycle, and that's what Russia was using on ads. So we're talking that what Clinton used in that, like the last weekend, and that whole Jay-Z and Beyonce concert bogus stuff, is what she used on that was a fraction, was basically like 30 times was like between 20 to 30 times of what they used during the actual whole election cycle of during the 2016 period. And if we're talking about what was actually spent, I mean, if we're talking that amount, that was just one event, and that shows you what amount that she was spending. If we're talking about what was going out, there wasn't much going out from Russia, and then Russia had a very, very minimal at best effect. And then if we look at what WikiLeaks was doing with it, WikiLeaks was actually not really covered. What really had the major effect on the election was Hillary's statements. When Hillary was stating that she was basically going to essentially blow up the world over basically virtually nothing, and that's basically going to scare the living hell out of most people, because people have become very, very wary of war ever since Barack Obama and George W. Bush have really stepped up the amount of war, and people have seen the horrors of it. And people have been like, no, we don't want that. And especially when you get the amount of war we've had, we say, no, we don't want this. And people go, no, we don't want it, because especially we don't want it against another world power, because we know the implications it'll cause. So they want it to basically be turned down. I mean, people of all walks of life have said that we don't want war to begin with. We don't want any type of military intervention, regardless of the case. The only things we want are basically just defending our actual homeland and our actual properties of the actual U.S., and that's it. And that's what's happening beyond the actual neoconservatives out there. I mean, that's pretty much neoconservatives and the actual pro-war Democrats. We're talking that's pretty much it. You might hear these pro-war chants from the Beltway, but you're not going to hear that from your average Americans out there. And it's because they've just become very, very war weary. And what caused her that with it is you do that with it, plus tell people that anybody who's considering voting for Trump or has voted for Trump is deplorable. You're not going to win an election like that, because it's saying anybody who's on the fence or anybody who is going to vote for Trump is deplorable. I hate to tell you, but you're not going to win an election. When you start adding those two things together, that's how elections get lost. And you can blame any other type of factor with it, but you're going to lose an election like that. And when you start to act insane like that, you're just going to lose elections. You can't act like an insane person. You need to act as a rational human being. And if you can't, you're going to lose elections. If you start spitting out insane ideas, then you're going to lose elections. You start saying, I think they hacked our election. I think they hacked our servers. So I'm going to outright bomb them when I get to be president. I'm going to, and then you state things. Anybody who thinks about voting for Trump or is going to vote for Trump, is deplorable. Well, you're insulting people, and you're stating that you want to basically go to World War III. And that has one outcome. And guess what you're going to get? You're going to get essentially a lost election. And that has only one result, is you're going to lose, and you can't blame anybody but yourself. And it doesn't matter how many bottles of vodka you drink after you lost an election, you can't change the outcome. Doesn't matter how many times you try to use the Justice Department and the FBI to overthrow an election. It doesn't matter what you do, how long you try to use the Democratic Party to establish a coup. It doesn't matter what you're trying to do. It's just a fact. It's basically, you're going to have to accept facts of, you lost the election, it's over, and you cannot run an election like that. It's completely and utterly insane. And when we look at these facts with it, unless you're willing to bring on people who are willing to get down to the truth, and unless you're willing to actually have a legitimate FBI investigation, which they weren't from the start. Even the Mueller investigation is completely illegitimate, because to have the legitimate investigation, you start with the actual servers, and you do your own investigation on them. They didn't. They left the DNC to do their own investigation on their own servers. That is completely illegitimate. That makes the whole investigation illegitimate. Because when it says, what's your, where do you have this evidence from? Oh, the DNC did their own investigation. Well, that's completely illegitimate, because you don't have you didn't do an actual gathering of your own evidence. All you're doing is you're basically going after people that are actually have done nothing to do with your actual scope of your investigation. You're going after people basically saying they're either basically misspoke to the FBI, or basically it has to do with something completely else, that basically you're arbitrarily bringing charges on them that you wouldn't bring on. They're bringing on one party but not the next, such as you're not charging Tony Podesta, but you're charging you're charging Paul Manafort on this, for the same charges, when they're working for the actual same exact group to benefit, which shows an exact bias in the actual investigation. You're giving immunity to one person, but not making him testify, but you're actually charging the other one, and basically trying to essentially give him life in prison for essentially doing nothing more than not mark himself as a foreign lobbyist, which was not even the scope of the investigation to begin with. And when we start to look at this, we see that basically the whole thing was a scam to begin with, and it's because it's like, if I can't prove this, I'm basically going to take down all the people who worked with the president to begin with, and it's completely illegitimate. And that's the whole point. And that it shows as is basically, I'm going to take down everybody possible. And when we're looking at it, and that's what we're getting at. And if you actually want a legitimate case, you pursue it like an actual criminal case. You stay on target. You get the actual evidence, and you investigate it yourself. You don't let the victim investigate the actual evidence, because then the actual stuff is tainted. The actual outcome is going to be tainted. It doesn't matter that they're using a third party. Essentially, you're letting the victim do this, because then the victim can claim anything. You're just going after what the actual outcome is. Basically, you're letting the victim claim whatever, and that's completely illegitimate from the actual start. And that's what needs to be understood. And that's why when we had this hearing, it's basically you're doing the same thing. You're grabbing a flawed witness to begin with, just to drag them out to create some type of a narrative that doesn't make any sense. Why don't we actually, if we're actually looking for something, why don't we actually go and look for the truth? And if we're looking for actual election interference, why don't we actually start practicing it ourselves? Look at the case of Venezuela. Why don't we actually say, we're not going to interfere and declare an actual president? Because frankly, they have an actual president currently. I don't care if we don't like him. I don't care if if the socialist system sucks. Why don't we actually say, we're going to leave it alone? The fact is we need to respect sovereignty. We keep intervening in these other systems and saying, well, we don't recognize your elections, such as in Crimea. We say, oh, we don't recognize your election. We're not going to recognize you as being part of Russia. Well, the fact is they don't want to be part of Ukraine, because Ukraine was essentially overthrown by the U.S. and the other Western areas, because we essentially forced in a neo-Nazi leader. And when we did that, that essentially changed the actual whole system. And there are a lot of Jews in Crimea, and Jews and Nazis don't get along. It's just natural. So what ends up happening is that's what it created. And the fact is when we intervene in these elections with it, we need to understand that the fact is there's always going to be some type of things where countries are going to look around at other elections and want to have preferable outcomes. But when it comes down to it is when it comes down to serious election interference, there's no other one that interferes any worse than the United States does. And when we're talking about basically illegitimate accusations against Russia for our election, when they were doing nothing more than really just advocating for certain benefits for their country, we actually do things to actually overthrow their elections, overthrow other elections around the globe, for this, completely with it. You look at what Barack Obama trying to end the idea of Brexit, trying to overthrow the Brexit vote, and we see all the time with these things, and they say, oh no, that's not election meddling. Well, that's the worst type of election meddling that we do with it. We assassinate leaders. And oh, that's not election meddling? Because we assassinate leaders we don't like? No, that's much worse than just a regular election meddling. And we need to understand that that's basically what we're doing. And this is what's happening. And the fact is with this accusation is based on a lot of lies. And it's basically just because one candidate lost and the other one won, and because the whole legacy media jumped on one candidate to win. And even after all of that, the people saw right through it and voted for the other candidate, and it didn't go the way everything was supposed to. Guess what? Things happen like that all the time. And this is just what happens out there. You're just going to have things like that happen because of that. And it just happens that people are going to do that. And people just go out there and they end up voting for who they're going to based on their own personal preferences. And it's just what ends up happening with these cases of doesn't matter if it's who's going to be Republican or Democrat or third party. And the fact is, you can't say, oh, my candidate lost, so there must be collusion from another nation. Well, that's not the case with it, because the fact is when a candidate really messes up, and even if the whole legacy media tried to actually throw the election, you can't blame that on the actual people for that, because they saw right through it. They saw when the whole legacy media was leaning one direction. That was so blatant, it was not even funny. And that's something that needs to be understood. And when you go on such one side, it's very, very disturbing for the people to see, and they don't like it when there's one-sided coverage and where they're making one candidate look very, very good and the other candidate they're blasting. And it does, people will see right through it. And then when you try to go keep doing it, what's going to happen is people will continue repeating it regardless of what you put out for polls. And this is the thing, is people will repeat the action of what they just did in the next election, in the next general election cycle. People keep repeating the action until you restore and they'll basically vote against what you're trying to do, because it's an actual reaction to the idea of throwing these elections toward a certain preferred candidate. And that's what needs to be understood, is it doesn't matter who the mainstream or legacy media prefers. It's just going to happen that way because they're going to see right through it. And people need to understand that when we see these preferred candidates that are being put forth, people end up getting very, very wary when the media starts to go all in on it. It looks like a banana republic, and it tends to look very, very fishy, so people tend to be very, very worried, and they go, nope, not going to vote for it. And it doesn't matter what we're talking about here. When they go all in on one candidate, they're going to basically go in the opposite direction. They're going to go, I don't trust this one bit. And they tend to go in the opposite direction because of that. And I think that was a lot of the pull for Bernie Sanders, regardless of socialism being against the actual best nature of people. Even as horrible as Hillary Clinton was with it, she was not going to bring people into socialism, which is just a god-awful system. And where you have people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez that started to talk about ideas of democide, or even hinting on it. And but the fact is people were still talking, were going completely against Clinton on the Democratic side, because the fact is when the whole legacy media was supporting her, something was seeming very, very suspicious. You had her being fed questions from CNN. You had all all the legacy media being paid off by the Clinton campaign. That was where a lot of their money was going. That was why they were running through cash like it was nobody's business, because it takes money to buy off these people that weren't necessarily going to be 100% supporters, and it costs a lot of money for that. And when it comes down to it, is when you start going through all this stuff with it to make a banana republic type of media, it does take a lot of money, but the end result is people get suspicious. So what ended up popping up is that there's going to be a lot of independent media that popped up, and people and foreign media which was going to which they didn't look toward, and that's what ended up happening. Was people look towards foreign media, and they can blame RT America, but RT America, if you look at their coverage, is quite neutral. They have shows that lean right. They have shows that lean a little bit down the middle. They tend to focus on more just right down the middle, or just reporting directly the facts. They have shows that lean left. They have shows a little more libertarian. They have shows a little more hawkish. And it tends to be a mix of kind of where everybody can kind of get their news. It tends to be where CNN kind of lost their way back a long time ago. If you even look at it, they have former CNN host Larry King on there, and when you see that they blame actually one of the intelligence reports actually blames a show for influencing voters, and the show actually ceased to air 1 year before the actual election season even started, which is actually insane. If you look at the one of the intelligence reports to blame Russia on the for this Russian collusion, you see that they actually try to blame a show on RT America for Russian collusion. That's one of the things they try to blame. Now, the show actually ceased to air 1 year before the actual election started. Now, this is actually a person who, in fact, voted for the person who hosted it. Actually, in fact, voted for Obama in 2008. Now, if we're going to get someone that's actually going to be voting for the person actually considers himself an independent, and they actually do not vote, do not consider themselves partisan on either side. So when it comes down to it, it's illegitimate to think that they are necessarily going to be pro-Trump or against Trump. If you look at some of the statements that they've made on their current show, is they are actually, a lot of times they've been highly critical of Trump. So to make that statement, it's completely illegitimate that to say that based on one show, there was one specific episode that was critical of Hillary Clinton, actually swayed an election that actually aired before before the election season actually started, on a show that actually on a show that ended before the election season started, and try to make that actual connection. I mean, it's completely illegitimate, and it's insane. And when they try to do these things with it, and this is on the actual intelligence report, when we start to look at the intelligence report that the intelligence agencies put together, we see it's completely incoherent. And this is where they came about with their thing of Russian collusion. Now, if we come about with what other people have come about, saying that there is no Russian collusion, and we see that the Facebook ads show that percentage-wise would have been, you would had to show that basically one out of maybe about 10,000 voters would have seen maybe one ad during the election season. Now, this would be very, very ineffective. because of the minimal amount spent. Now, this shows that it wasn't very effective. They can say, oh, but there were Bernie Sanders groups and there were Donald Trump groups. Okay, there were already those groups that existed before. That's number two. With that, and that kind of disproves that point. Now, when we look at the next point, is that we see that now we look at the next point. We see that they'll try to make the point of the on the intelligence reports is that the things that Russia was pushing for were all negative to Clinton, and this is frankly not true. And when we start to look at that, we see that the points that Clinton was advocating for would have actually been positive to Russia, because it would have helped out in their energy control of Europe. The only things that would have been negative would have been her points on foreign policy. So we see that was actually kind of split. We see another point that's when we start to look at the actual thing of stating that it had to be Russia. Well, when we start to look at the intelligence, is did you actually examine the actual devices? Well, no, we never examined the actual devices. So the actual thing is no. Since you never examined them, you're going off assumptions, and which means you're basically have no ability to know what you're talking about. The only people who've actually examined them were actually groups hired by the Democratic Party, meaning that they're actually flawed by their actual perspective. Their perspective would be to cite anything that would be in the best interest of the Democratic Party to cite, which would be basically to blame someone else other than to state that it was in the perspective of the Democratic Party itself that the actual leak or hack happened. Because if they would have cited that, then it would have led to a basic criminal case, and it would have led to most likely something internal. And if it was internal, then then you start to lead to people within the actual organization, and that's something completely different. Now we start to look at now we get back to the idea of Cohen. What does Cohen have anything to do with this? Well, Cohen's basically to paint Trump as being some type of unreliable person, and it's trying to paint some type of legitimacy to those Billy Bush tapes, and trying to paint the Billy Bush tapes as not being election interference, which they clearly were. That was election interference by NBC to actually influence the outcome of the election before the actual election itself. And this was actually an actual station itself, which is illegal. You cannot, as an actual independent media organization, you cannot actually do any electioneering unless you give equal time to both parties, which meant that basically, unless they were giving something, they would essentially be siding against Hillary Clinton, which would have meant giving some type of report on the WikiLeaks and an actual full open report, they could not have released those Billy Bush tapes, which meant that the action of that was essentially electioneering. And that's where we get to the point of that was deliberate electioneering on the case of Hillary Clinton, which is the actual case of a violation and actually election interference within the actual country itself. And that's what needs to be understood with that, and which nobody tends to bring up, because the fact is it would totally flip the narrative. Because the fact is, a lot of people don't want to bring up election interference. They would actually go not against Trump, but against Hillary Clinton, and that a station would do it on behalf of Hillary Clinton. And we see that NBC did that, and NBC has been noted for being highly liberal, and they've always maintained that, and they've maintained that for a long time. And and this has not exactly been the NBC, Comcast, doesn't matter what you want to call them, they've maintained this for a long time. So when we see this, is we'll see this even in their writing for their shows, they maintain this. So when we see with that, we would essentially, they would have had to release some type of complete and utter analysis on the WikiLeaks releases at the same time, but they did not. What was happening at the same time was people were stating that that the WikiLeaks releases are illegal and you cannot read them, and if you read them, you're doing something illegal. And this was what was happening on all legacy media. Doesn't matter if we're talking about Fox, doesn't matter if we're talking about NBC, ABC, CBS, CNN, MSNBC. All of them were doing the exact same things at the same time. They're all talking about the same thing, saying you can't read these are illegal. If you're doing so, you're doing something illegal. And this is what was coming out, and trying to scare people away from doing so. And this is because it was essentially a correspondent action by the Clinton campaign to pay a lot of these people. Even within Fox, I mean, there's payroll numbers that actually show, going back to people like Shepard Smith, going back to people even on to try to contact Bill O'Reilly, to try to contact others on Fox, Megyn Kelly, and others at many more at Fox. There's people basically throughout the people at MSNBC, CNN, pretty much the whole lineup's there, contacting those people that were especially the ones that might have been on the fence, to essentially basically cut them checks. And if it's not the actual person themselves, to cut the director a check, and to ensure that that's not going to make it into the script for the day, and to make sure that that the script for the day becomes this statement that reading the WikiLeaks is illegal and all of that other garbage, and it was basically a talking point. And that's what was going out. Well, that was essentially to make sure that the Billy Bush tape was going out as the major thing, and making sure to block the people from going and reading the WikiLeaks. And it was the whole point. And when people talk about the whole thing with it, they try to blame all the thing on WikiLeaks with it, where not many people read it. Very, very few people got any of the details from it, but everybody knows what happened with the Billy Bush tape because that got blasted everywhere. It was everywhere on the TV. It was basically blasted through every single newspaper. Everybody knows exactly what was on that. Very few people know what was actually in the WikiLeaks. And that's the whole difference. It needs to be understood. And people don't understand that. And people need to understand that that's what's going on. And when it goes back to these Cohen things with it is, if Cohen was really much of a lawyer, he would have been out there. If he was Mr. I'm here to be an ally to Trump, he would have been right there to block those Billy Bush tapes. Where was he for those? And if he was there with it, but the fact is we know that he's a Democratic ally. He has been since the start, and he knew if he would have blocked those Billy Bush tapes, that he would have basically have been essentially he would have essentially helped out Trump, and Trump would have been automatically elected. And he didn't want that. He essentially wanted Clinton to be elected. He just wanted to get his money for blocking these extortion payments. He didn't want to block the extortion payments because he wanted to get his money through that, his little collection at the top, for his lawyer fees. And that was the whole point. So he knew what was going on with that. So he didn't want to basically lose all of that. He wanted to essentially ensure that he was getting his fees with that. He just never wanted to. He just didn't want to essentially assure that he was going to. He would never have done anything to undermine Clinton, and because he was voting for Clinton in the election. And that would have been insane in his political mind to do something to undermine Clinton. Why would he have done that? Because he would have never protected Trump there. And that's one thing with it. When we're talking about, that's one of the things they were talking about in the Cohen hearing, is what are they doing to protect? What about this and this to protect Trump? He said he was doing things to protect Trump. Well, what about the Billy Bush tape? When it's talking about him trying to stop these things, stopping a lot of things from hitting these major things from actually hitting the air and from hitting newspapers. Well, the Billy Bush tape was able to go right through, and he did nothing. Well, it looks like he was essentially politically inclined to let that hit, and basically sat around doing nothing. If he was actually looking at protecting Trump from any type of bad reputation, he sure as hell really failed that one. Because if my lawyer were looking to protect my reputation, that would have been the first thing to basically block, because you know that they were going to basically be running with everything with that, and that was right before the actual election. That would have been the most important time. The other stuff would have been basically could have been defeated off real easy with these extortion artists, which would have been considered quite minor in comparison to that. This is why Michael Cohen shows us a very, very questionable at best. What do you call it? Witness for this actual case of Russia-U.S. Election interference involving Trump. I mean, he doesn't even show to be the least bit credible. When we're looking at what should be a credible witness, he states that he was trying to look out for Trump's best interest. Well, he totally blew that one when it comes to the Billy Bush tape. He let that one hit the airwaves when he was still being paid, because apparently he was still being paid up until up even into 2017, apparently to his recollection. So what the hell was he doing with that one? Why he let the Billy Bush tape go right through if he was so-called this person helping us out his reputation? Then we have his reliability from what the actual judge said is that he's basically known a liar without remorse, which shows that he's not reliable when it comes to the actual being a witness, because he's basically going to dispute facts, being that he's not going to have any remorse. So this is going to make him very, very poor of an actual witness itself. Then when we start looking at other things with it, he was you had the hiring of Lanny Davis, of essentially saying that he's never been he's not being paid, which is highly questionable. You had the potential link of Tom Steyer, which is an extremist left-wing donor. You have all these other things which basically that only meeting with the Democratic side, even meeting with Adam Schiff after they came to the conclusion in the U.S. Senate, when they start forming this idea of start interviewing witnesses on the House of Representatives side, which shows that they're mad about the conclusion on the Senate side, and it shows us basically trying to get revenge, and it shows that there's a lot of questionable points on this, and that basically that they're basically just looking at just trying to get revenge on Trump, and they're not actually looking for a conclusion. It's just about trying to get revenge, which is why we see limited scope of questions, and not actually looking on trying to find out how reliable the witness is and trying to get facts and about what actually went on. And you're not going to, the point of bringing in a witness with limited information is pointless. This is a witness with limited information to begin with. Why would you even bring him in? Well, they want to bring him in because this witness has been speaking a lot of bad things about Trump. He's a lifelong Democrat, and it's essentially, from the Democrat side, it's a perfect witness. From an actual legitimate side, it makes no sense. And that's the whole point. And when we're talking about logic, there is no actual logic to the actual idea of the examination. From the actual idea of logic for trying to create a let's hang Trump, it makes perfect logic. And that's basically what this is, and that's all it's become. Now, if they're actually looking for, let's try to actually create a system where we actually want to earn votes in the 2020 election, they're not going to be winning many people over, because people are getting very, very tired of the Russia-Trump story. It's gotten old. Actually do something. They wanted to see you actually do something. What's actually going to put more money in their pockets? This means cut more spending and cut more taxes. Start paying down the debt, which is going to help the economy grow. Stop just doing this little, we're going to keep it revenue neutral. No more revenue neutral, pay down the debt. You need to actually start basically saying, we're going to actually pay down debt now. We need to actually start to actually see this debt and actually start paying it down. You can't let it keep rising up. You cannot keep doing that. You need to basically say the money that comes in, we need to start basically paying all of that down. You cannot let it go up anymore. You have to start paying it down, and this needs to happen immediately. Even if it means things getting a little bit rough for a while, and things are going to be rough, and unless you want the economy to actually start working for everyone, nothing's going to happen until that point. And we don't have the actual money to start giving away. and that's the whole point. And when we start wasting our time with this garbage, you're going to find this. And we see people doing this garbage. We need to start basically, the way it's going to happen is you're going to have to basically say, we're going to let all spending expire, we're going to basically start restarting up spending. Now, now basically the Democrats are not going to want to let that happen because they think they're going to lose votes. Well, you're going to have to be bold when it comes to doing things. If you want to actually be smart, you need to start all spending expire and only restart up spending that can actually gain the proper amount of votes, which means 60. And that's the only way you can actually get the actual economy going back again. And that's the only way you're going to get an actual productive government. And it means there's going to be a lot of things actually cut. There's going to be a lot of military cuts, which means you're going to have to change your actual theory of how you use the military, which means you're probably going to have to pull out of all these countries. You're probably only going to be able to guard the United States alone. You're probably going to have to end NATO. You're probably going to have to tell all these countries you were giving foreign aid to, sorry, the game's over. You're probably the idea of regime change is over, and all of these things are going to be over, and it's just going to have to be a fact. And it's just a matter of fact of what happens. And instead of wasting your time on this with it, I mean, you're going to have to be very, very smart. I mean, doing these things like this and trying to play the blame Trump game, it's not going to work, because the fact is you're just going to irritate voters. Voters want more money in their pocket. You do this by basically understanding how the economy works, with it basically decentralizing the financial industry. This is done very, very simply. And the Federal Reserve put all money back in gold and silver. Make that your actual currency. Get rid of paper. Paper's useless. When you do that, people are actually going to have money to spend. Yes, it's going to hurt your buddies in the banking industry, but that have actually bankrolled your elections, Democrats. But the fact is in the end, it's going to be beneficial for the actual constituents that are going to thank you in the end, because they're going to get all of their purchase power back in when it comes down to them earning their money. These are going to be paid in these in gold and silver, and it's going to basically it's going to make them have to work with a 100% reserve currency, which is going to help when you actually have a fractional reserve currency. It just basically starts stealing their money again, because when they put the money in, and then they're going to start taking that money out. Now, people are going to try to make the argument, oh, if we don't have a central bank, then when the bank gets robbed with it, they're not going to get their money back. No, frankly is every time they do that, every time they replace that money, the fact is they're losing their value, and that's what happens with it. We have security systems now that just doesn't happen anymore, and we've gotten to the point to where these vaults can do that, and especially if we're exchanging gold and silver, we can essentially put those in actual vaults very, very quickly. And especially if we are doing things digitally and exchanging things digitally in gold and silver in a cashless form for most of our transactions, we can actually do that very, very without the actual need. of this stuff. It would be only in the case of where someone wanted the actual holding of this money, and that'd be only in a rare occasion. So most of the time, the actual rounds of silver and gold would actually be held in the actual vault, meaning that it would not be removed. Something completely different, and that would be a lot better for these people. But wasting your time on this Cohen hearing is completely illegitimate, because all Democrats know what the actual truth is. All of them do. They know that this is a farce. They know that basically they lost the election fair and square, and they know that basically if they keep this up, they're going to lose the next election. So when we view this, we need to view it in that manner. But now if you like this video, like, subscribe, click the notification bell, share it all the way on social media, and I will see you guys later today on the 6th Amendment. And if you haven't done already, check out the Patreon notification either in the chat, or if you check this out later, check it in the description in the bottom here. And that's about it. Bye, everyone.